Hello and welcome to the News by Standards. The number of people sleeping rough in England rose by more than a quarter last year, official statistics suggest. On a single night in autumn, 3,069 people slept outside, 26% more than in 2021, says the Department of Levelling Up, Communities and Housing. The rise follows 4 years of decreases in rough sleeping, partly due to initiatives during the pandemic. Rising prices are forcing people who have never slept rough before onto the streets, says Charities. But in Bristol, military veteran Simon Gilchrist blames his drug addiction for keeping him on the streets. The 48-year-old fears he will be dead by 50. Either the streets will kill me or the drugs. People who say go get a job don't know about addiction or why people take crack cocaine and heroin and alcohol, he said. During the pandemic, the Everyone In initiative provided more than 37,000 rough sleepers with a place to stay, but many were not found permanent homes and were at risk of being back on the streets. The new figures suggest the number of people sleeping rough is 35% lower than the peak in 2017, but 74% higher than in 2010. Charities say they are seeing a difference in the type of people who have been seeking their help in recent months. Many have never slept rough before. Julie Dempster from Bristol Outreach Services for the Homeless puts it down to the rising cost of living. It's really frightening for those people who have not been homeless before, she said. The rental increase in Bristol is absolutely huge. It is a common refrain in the city. The cost of a one-bed flat, for instance, has increased by almost 20% since 2019 to £950 a month. However, the maximum level of housing benefit for such properties has been frozen for 3 years at £695 a month. We're seeing more people starting to sleep rough who haven't had the experience of homelessness before, said David Ingerslev from homeless charity St Mungo's. He said that the rising cost of energy, fuel and food means people aren't always able to prioritise their rents. They may choose to move out to sleep in the car for a short time, hoping they'll be able to find something. It doesn't come to pass, and so people end up sleeping rough. We meet 23-year-old Samuel Atkinson sitting outside the Julian Trust Night shelter, waiting for the doors to open. Samuel has been homeless for 2 months after his relationship broke down, deciding to walk away from a toxic environment, even though he had nowhere to go. A trained bricklayer, he counts himself as one of the lucky ones, as he has found cover in Bristol's bus shelter on nights he could not get a bed. It's warm, you feel secure, it's somewhere you can rest your head for a few hours. Despite his situation, Samuel has a smile on his face. He is due to move into his own flat in the next few weeks and describes himself as an on and upward curve. It will mean the world to me to know I've got my own place, somewhere I can feel safe. The night shelter has room for 12 beds. All are pre-allocated to referrals from Bristol City Council, but occasionally someone doesn't show up, allowing the staff to offer any spare beds on a first-come, first-served basis. On the night they visit, Samuel gets a bed, but behind him in the queue, Simon Gilchrist isn't so lucky. Simon has been sleeping rough in Bristol for the past fortnight, having recently lost a hostel place. He has been homeless off and on for many years, a consequence of his drug addiction. He often sleeps on concrete behind a hotel, using the hot air the air conditioning unit pumps out to try to ward off the cold. It gets into your bones, he said. I feel very alone. Labour's shadow homelessness and rough sleeping minister Paula Barker urged ministers not to stand idly by while a toxic mix of rising rents, the cost of living crisis and a failure to end no-fault evictions hit vulnerable people. A Department of Levelling Up Communities and Housing spokesperson said, "We know there is more to do to help families at risk of losing their homes and to end rough sleeping for good. Measures include abolishing no-fault evictions and better funding for initiatives to end rough sleeping," said the official. Price of pasta has nearly doubled in 2 years, news research from the BBC suggests. A standard 500 gram bag of pasta was 50 pence 2 years ago. Now it's 95 pence. They have been tracking the cost of a small basket of 15 everyday essentials. The total has gone up by £5.34 from £15.79 in 2021 to £21.13 in 2023. Official figures suggest overall UK inflation may have peaked at 11.1% in October, but the rate of food prices rises are still running at 16.7%. Changes in the average cost of 15 food items in January at Asda, Tesco, Morrisons and Sainsbury's were tracked by the retail research firm Associa. The items are a mix of everyday essentials from oven chips and strawberry jam to pasta sauce and potatoes. They were chosen so we could compare some of the most popular items across the value and standard ranges. The cheaper value basket hasn't risen as fast, but the rate of increase is much closer to the standard basket over the last year. Kay Staniland, director at Associa, said the figures show the real price rises that shoppers are seeing each week. It's inflation on top of inflation at the moment. Prices were already rising rapidly last January, and that was before the war in Ukraine, which then triggered a huge increase in the price of gas, as well as disrupting supplies of grains, vegetable oils and fertilizer. That's when the cost of groceries really started to rocket. According to James Walton, chief economist at the IGD, a research charity in the food and consumer goods industry, it could hit 17 to 90% in the first half this year, with the rate of increase starting to fall quickly after that. Or putting it another way, food prices will still be going up by the end of the year, but more more slowly than before. Food production is incredibly energy intensive, but with wholesale gas prices falling sharply, along with a drop in the price of global food commodities like wheat, why are food prices in our supermarket shelves still rising? One big reason is the lag between food producers being hit with higher costs and when their products end up in store, said Mr. Walton from the IGD. The food supply chain is extremely complicated. The products can change hands many times before they come to us as the consumer, and so it takes a long time for the cost increases at the start of the supply chain to be passed down all the steps until we actually encounter them in the store. There are always price hikes in January. Retailers try to hold back from increasing the cost of products till after the key Christmas trading period. According to Associa, 10,000 products went up in price over the new year, but this is more than double the number that rose in price during the same period last year. I'm not surprised everyone's got increased costs. Kit Kat maker Nestle, for instance, recently announced it would raise prices again this year despite an 8.2% increase in 2022. Food shortages don't help. Bad weather has disrupted supplies of fresh fruit and veg, which we rely on from overseas at this time of the year. And British growers have been planting fewer crops like tomatoes and cucumbers because of the huge heating costs for greenhouses. They've also struggled to find seasonal labour to pick them. They're just not planting enough stuff here because it's uneconomic, says Adam Leyland, editor-in-chief of the Grocer magazine. We'll have to import most of our stuff from elsewhere, and that inevitably means inflation because the cost of doing so is higher. British growers say they need higher prices to survive. Overall, our food bills look set to get worse before they get better, but according to Mr. Walton, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Assuming no nasty shocks like a drought, he believes prices will fall at some point in the future, helped by the incredibly competitive nature of grocery retailing in the UK. Each of the different parties is watching the other very closely for some sign of negotiating advantage. If a supermarket thinks that the cost of production has come down, well, of course, they'll bring the supplier into their office and say we want our prices to come down as well. The ferocious desire for a better deal is actually what is probably the shopper's best protection against price inflation, but there's still little respite for shoppers right now. Rising milk, egg and margarine prices have contributed to a record increase in the cost of food and drink in shops, research suggests. Grocery prices in the 4 weeks to 19th of February rose 17.1% from a year ago, research firm Kantar said, the highest rate since its records began in 2008. Kantar said 1 in 4 shoppers were now struggling financially. It added that households faced an £811 increase to their annual grocery bill if they did not change shopping habits. Food prices began to surge last year when the war in Ukraine triggered a huge rise in energy costs and disrupted supplies of grains, vegetable oils and fertilizer. Fraser McKevitt, head of retail and consumer insight at Kantar, said the company's research had found that grocery price inflation was the second most important financial issue for the public behind energy costs. The latest price data was disappointing, he told the BBC. There was hope at the beginning of this year that inflation in food and drink was going to start falling, but it seems to have kicked up again, and that's before the latest news about shortages in fruit, veg and salads. We're hoping that price inflation will start moderating this year, but that doesn't mean that prices will fall, it just means they won't be going up quite so quickly, he added. Kantar said that shoppers were continuing to favour supermarket-owned brands in an attempt to save money. Sales of own brand goods were up 13.2% in February, compared with a 4.6% rise in branded goods. Research carried out by the BBC found that some basic goods have nearly doubled in price over the past 2 years. For example, a standard 500-gram bag of pasta that cost 50p 2 years ago is now priced at 95p. The research found that the cost of a small basket of 15 everyday essentials has gone up by £5.34 from £15.79 in 2021 to £21.13 in 2023. Commenting on the recent limits that supermarkets have been placing on fruits and vegetable sales, Mr. Bekevitz said, while 43% of all grocery baskets contain at least one fresh produce item, pack limits are unlikely to drastically affect consumers as we usually buy fruit and veg in smaller quantities. For instance, only 1% of tomato purchases last year involved more than 3 packs. The discount supermarket chains have continued to see rapid growth, Kantar said, with both Aldi and Lidl seeing their sales grow by more than a quarter over the past year. Kantar also said that online retailer Ocado had put in a strong performance, bucking a downward trend in online sales. The figures from Kantar came as Ocado reported full-year results. These showed that the average number of items bought per visit fell from 52 in 2021 to 46 last year. Although this was the same amount as before the pandemic, online grocery shopping saw a huge rise during the pandemic as people sought to avoid travelling to stores. Ocado Chief Executive Tim Steiner said, Ocado Retail, our UK joint venture with M&S, has shown its resilience against a backdrop of higher costs and smaller baskets, reflecting the COVID unwind and the UK cost of living crisis by growing customer numbers and increasing online market share. However, the Ocado Group reported a worse than expected loss of £500.8 million for 2022 compared compared with a $176.9 million deficit the year before. Ocado announced it would be stepping up the supermarket price war from Wednesday by comparing prices with more than 10,000 like-for-like products on Tesco's website. It will give customers money off their next shop if the cost of their goods would have been cheaper at Tesco. All of the main supermarkets are competing fiercely amid the cost of living crisis, either through cutting prices, pledging not to charge more than their rivals. From the outside, it looks like an ordinary corporate building, lots of glass and steel, but this factory in the south of the Netherlands belongs to ASML, and the machines made there are anything but ordinary. In fact, the technology is so advanced and so much in demand that ASML has become Europe's most valuable technology firm. So what is made there? ASML designs and makes the machines which make computer chips, but not any old computer chips. ASML machines make the most advanced computer chips, and it's the only company in the world with that kind of technology. This effective monopoly means that exactly how ASML's machines work is subject to some of the most stringent corporate security in the world. Nevertheless, we were given a tour of its plants and were guided through the basics. Microchips are made by building up complex patterns of transistors or miniature electrical switches layer by layer on a silicon wafer. They are printed using a lithography system where light is projected through a blueprint of the pattern of those miniature switches. The light is then shrunk and focused using advanced optics, and the pattern is etched onto a photosensitive silicon wafer. That pattern forms the security of a silicon chip that might end up in a computer, phone, or any other electrical device you might care to mention. The crucial aspect of ASML's most advanced machines is that they can work at any tiny scales by generating superfine extreme ultraviolet light, just 13.5 nanometers. Sander Hoffman from ASML likens it to using pens with different tips. Because of the small wavelength, that means that you basically are using a finer liner to draw these lines of integrated security instead of older generation machines which use maybe a marker pen. The ability to etch the silicon with such fine circuits means you can cram more components onto the silicon, which in turn means electronic devices can have more processing power and more memory whilst remaining at the same size. The machine operates in a vacuum, as the whole processor of etching a chip can be derailed by the tiniest of impurities, like a rogue skin particle. Technician Bram Matheson was putting together one of ASML's latest designs when we visited the factory. Mr. Matheson works in one of the cleanest environments on the planet. There are moments where we have to wear over gloves to make sure we don't leave any fingerprints, to make sure we don't bring any extra dust into the machine. A single fingerprint can cause significant damage to the machine. The machines themselves are very substantial and complex. One extreme ultraviolet EUV machine can take a year to assemble and deliver. Last year, the company delivered only 50 of their highest specification model and 400 machines in total. Those sales plus income from the management and upgrading of existing machines made the company 21.2 billion euros last year. The orders they have in the pipeline are worth double that. The sales growth means a growing workforce, up by a third over the last 12 months. Wayne Learn, a consultant with technology research firms CCS Insights, says the machines ASML make take years, if not decades, to develop and perfect. ASML have been working on its latest specification machines since the early 2000s, leaving other companies in the field with quite a bit of catching up to do. I'm sure there are competitors in the works, however in the near term there isn't any true competitor to ASML, he says. Not bad for a company once described by the BBC as relatively obscure, a quote which Mr. Hoffman has printed on a hoodie. Being such a crucial cog in the global electronics industry comes with difficulties. ASML currently finds itself caught in the rivalry between the US and China. China has long wanted to make the most advanced computer chips, for which it needs ASML machines, but since 2019 the US has effectively been blocking ASML from exporting those machines to China. Joris Tier, a strategic analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, says the US is keen to prevent China from catching up in chip technology. The US has moved their goals from having a couple of generations of an advantage on their rivals to we must maintain as large as lead as possible, which can also mean you must put your rivals back as far as possible. There are reports that an agreement has been reached between Dutch and US authorities over ASML exports, but the details have not been published. In a statement reacting to the news, ASML said any restrictions would need lengthy work before legislation can be implemented. In the long term, ASML Chief Executive Peter Wenick does not think this business would be badly affected by export restrictions. If the semiconductors cannot be made in China, they will be made in South Korea, in the US, or in Europe, or in Taiwan, so ultimately we will ship those machines because the world needs that capacity, he says. The Energy Secretary says he is very sympathetic to suggestions that the government should stop a planned £500 rise in annual energy bills from April. Grant Shapps said he was working hard with Chancellor Jeremy Hunt on the issue. There are warnings that 1 million more households could struggle if bills go up again. The government is limiting reducing the typical annual energy bill to £2,500, but this will increase to £3,000 from the 1st of April. The Treasury has so far resisted calls to extend the scheme at current levels. However, the cost of delivering the Energy Price Guarantee, the EPG, has fallen sharply in recent months because wholesale gas prices have decreased, putting pressure on Mr Hunt to change course. A growing number of experts believe the Chancellor could use the budget on the 15th of March to scrap the increase. National Energy Action estimates that 1.5 million more households will go into fuel poverty as a result of bill increases currently planned for April. That typically means having to spend more than 10% of their income on energy. Mr Shapps told the Times newspaper, "I completely recognise the argument over keeping that price guarantee in place, and the Chancellor and I are working very hard on it. I'm very sympathetic to making sure that we protect people. We're looking at this very carefully. Without the government's energy price guarantee, a typical household gas and electricity bill would have hit £4,279 a year from January under the energy price cap, which is set by Ofgem, the industry regulator. In normal times, the cap limits the amount suppliers can charge per unit of energy. The price cap will fall to £3,280 a year from April, according to Ofgem, and most analysts expect it to go below £2,500 from July, at which point the government would no longer need to subsidise households. In theory, this means the government would only have to maintain the energy price guarantee at current levels for the 3 months from April until July. But Mr Hunt has said it lacks the financial headroom to do so. However, the IFS think tank believes the Treasury could afford the estimated £2.7 billion cost, as government borrowing has been lower than expected this year. IFS Director Paul Johnson said it would be a very straightforward thing for them to do and politically beneficial. Consumer finance expert Martin Lewis said he believed the government was more likely to cancel the planned rise than go through with it. And Torsten Bell of the Resolution Foundation, a think tank which is focused on people on low and middle incomes, estimated there was only a 10% chance the energy price guarantee would be changed in April. Any late decision by the government could cause some confusion for bill payers. However, energy suppliers must notify their customers of price increases at least a month in advance of the rise. A less generous price guarantee would mean prices going up at the start of April, and therefore companies writing to or emailing their customers on Wednesday. Any subsequent decision by ministers to keep the scheme at its current level would mean suppliers having to write a second letter explaining the situation to their customers. On Monday, Energy UK, which represents suppliers, said falling wholesale costs means the EPG has cost the government a lot less than has been expected, so we, alongside many charities and consumer groups, are urging them to use this surplus to hold the EPG at £2,500 and to announce that quickly so it can be incorporated in customer bills in time for April. Looking back at the start of the coronavirus pandemic, Professor Paul Elkington said it was soon apparent that he and his colleagues would run out of PPE, personal protective equipment. "I'm a lung doctor, and by mid-March 2020, we realised the process we had to protect our staff was not going to be sustainable," says Professor Elkington, a respiratory consultant at University Hospital Southampton. "We were initially wearing disposable FFP3 masks, gowns and visors, but within a few weeks it was obvious we weren't going to be able to maintain those supplies. As the airborne coronavirus spread around the world, urgent demand for PPE led to severely stretched supply chains and rationing of supplies in many countries. In the UK, doctors like Professor Elkington were forced to improvise. His team came up with the PERSO, a personal battery-powered respirator device worn over the head like a hood with a clear window that travels around with you. Priced at around £225 each and lightweight and reusable, it works using a replacement HEPA, high-efficiency particulate absorbing filter, which sterilises incoming air. Over time, it became clear that not only was PERSO more comfortable and efficient, but it was more cost-effective versus disposable PPE. The PERSO respirator was not only used in Southampton, but across 16 other NHS trusts. Crucially, staff absences were lower at Professor Elkington's hospital than the rest of the country. He and a colleague, Professor Howell Morgan, both later won an MBE for their work producing the respirator, but despite talks with Dyson, they decided not to patent their design. Instead, they made it open source, publishing the design on the internet so that others could produce it in South Africa, among other countries. Fast forward to 2023, and supplying PPE remains a deeply emotive issue for everyone because so many people got burnt, says one senior NHS manager who asked not to be named. He specifically references how procurement managers at the height of the crisis found themselves desperately paying higher prices for products largely from China, some of which turned out to be unsuitable or even fake. 3 billion pieces of PPE were used by the NHS in just the first 6 months of the crisis, according to research. However, the Department for Health and Social Care accounts for 2020 to 2021 reveal that £673 million worth of PPE bought during the pandemic was unusable, while £750 million of equipment was not used before its expiry date. Relying on just one supply country was always a horrible risk, says Willie Shee, the Robert and Jane Sirik Professor of Management Practice at Harvard Business School, who studies global supply chains. He says that the primary challenge with PPE is governments not buying supplying until they really urgently need it, demand is very spiky. Professor Shi wants to see strategic reserves of national stockpiles created. He also makes the point that if you want to retain domestic manufacturing capacity on tap, it costs you money to keep that manufacturing facility warm and functioning. Aside from the environmental costs, spending money to ship disposable PPE from China, storing it in a warehouse, and getting rid of the waste after it has been used is all painfully expensive. Analysis from sustainable experts like Dr. Chantal Roussan, clinical lecturer in sustainable healthcare at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, suggests that the best way of tackling this problem is threefold. Firstly, by dramatically reducing the use of gloves and replacing them with more hand washing and combining this with manufacturing PPE closer to home, and crucially extending the use of reuse of things like masks and gowns. Dr. Tom Dawson says that until around 2004, drapes and gowns used in hospitals operating theatres were largely made of cotton, but then there was a rapid shift to disposable plastics. He is a former emergency medicine doctor who founded Revolution Zero, a reusable medical textile company, in May 2020. Dr. Dawson describes the PPE chaos of the pandemic and the inevitable deaths that followed as painful to watch. In response, he designed a robust suite of reusable gowns, aprons, surgeons, drapes, and caps. His textile products, typically made from polyester or cotton, range from £4 for masks and wraps up to £50 for specialist draping systems. Using a specialised laundry process and 134 centigrade sterilisation, they can be used multiple times before being repurposed into other healthcare items such as screens. But swapping from disposable to reusables is not a simple fix for most hospitals because they no longer have laundry facilities on site. It's all been outsourced. So although Dr. Dawson has an enthusiastic interest from 150 trusts, he's having to work at building the firm's own decontamination units and laundries that are on or close to healthcare sites. One such facility is due to open in Cornwall in April. Meanwhile, the firm sold more than £300,000 worth of products to date, and overseas medical charity Medicines Sans Frontières will soon be using Revolution Zero's products for their operations in Mozambique and Kyrgyzstan. But what can hospitals do with used plastic PPE waste? That is where Welsh Thermal Compaction Group comes in. Its machines, which are about the size of a US fridge freezer, melt down used plastic PPE at more than 300 centigrades. The plastic is then compressed and cooled to create solid blocks. Hospitals can then sell these blocks to manufacturers who will use them to make new plastic products, such as buckets. The firm has sold more than 100 units, mainly in the UK, but also in Australia and the Netherlands. It is also just about to enter into a deal with the US Navy, who want to adapt its units for use on warships. Some customers buy the processing units while others rent them. An average hospital might pay anywhere from £1,000 per month up to £2,500 depending on volumes and equipment needed. The other strategy to reduce the volume of PPE waste is to avoid its use in the first place. Post-pandemic, it is rare to see any healthcare worker without gloves, but research shows that frequently using non-sterile gloves can lead to poor hand hygiene and may even increase transmission of preventable infections. This happens because people forget to change them at key moments during a shift, for example moving from a computer back to examining a patient. Among others, University Hospitals Sussex and London's Great Ormond Street are continuing with a gloves off project to try to cut use and encourage hand washing instead. We could drastically reduce inappropriate use of gloves with more education around when you don't need them, says Paul Shivers, head of PPE Innovation and Innovations and Sustainability at NHS Supply Chain. He says workers only need to wear them if in contact with bodily fluids or highly infectious patients. Mr. Shivers estimates that reducing the number of times workers wear gloves has the potential to save £48 million in procurement costs or 9.5 tonnes of waste in NHS England. Back in Southampton, Professor Elkington is sceptical that the UK is best prepared for the next pandemic in any meaningful way. My worry is that the painful lessons of the early pandemic have been completely forgotten, he says, pointing to the current funding crisis overwhelming the NHS. Someone somewhere should be saying we've had to learn these lessons from the pandemic. We need a plan, a government-driven strategy. He adds that in the meantime, most of his hospital staff are keeping their personal respirators on standby in their offices. At least we're ready within this hospital for the next one. We have 5,000 ready. 3 stretches of water off the English coast are to get the strictest possible environmental protections as part of new measures to restore the health of the seas. Fishing will be banned along with all activities that damage the seabed, such as mining and laying cables. Proposals to bring in highly protected marine areas, HPMAs, at 2 other sites have been dropped. Critics say the plans lack ambition and progress is far too slow. Professor Callum Roberts of the University of Exeter said the areas would make a big difference to the sea life within them, but covered only 0.5% of the English seas. At this rate of progress, it will take 260 years to get to the level of protection that science says it needs, which is 30% of the seas highly protected, he said. The Wildlife Trust said they would be calling on the government to designate eliminate more fully protected marine areas as soon as possible. I'm totally dismayed that the government has only decided to designate 3 of the 5 proposed HPMAs, said Head of Marine Conservation Dr. Lisa Beatty. They're a good first step, but we really need to do more if we're to turn the tide on nature's recovery and bring wildlife back. Richard Hill of the Marine Conservation Society echoed her words. It's a step forward, but a baby step, he said. It's a shame the government isn't being a bit more ambitious in protecting our seas. The areas to be given full protection include Allonby Bay in Cumbria, inshore waters that harbour a wealth of marine life including sponges, soft coral, seaweed, sea squirt, anemone and living reefs built by the honeycomb worm. Dolphin Head, a stretch of water far off the Sussex coast that's home to dolphins, porpoises, seabirds and fish. The northeast of Farnes Deep, 35 miles off the coast of Northumberland. The seabed is rich in strange and rare life forms, including long-lived mollusks and squat lobsters. The waters teem with seabirds and marine mammals, including the white-beaked dolphin. Proposals at Northumberland's Holy Island were dropped after fears were voiced that a ban on fishing could devastate the local economy. A similar plan for Trevelyan in a Silver Pit South, 16 miles off the coast of Lincolnshire, was also ditched. The area is a fishing ground for cod, plaice, herring and sole. The new scheme gives 3 areas off England for protection against damage from fishing, mining and development as part of a target to protect 30% of marine waters by 2030. A DEFRA spokesman said highly protected marine areas will offer the highest levels of protection in our seas, helping a wide range of marine habitats and species to fully recover. Seas are under pressure from decades of overexploitation, pollution and climate change. While 38% of seas around the British Isles are designated marine reserves, many are still subject to damaging fishing practices such as bottom trawling, where fishing gear is dragged along the seabed. The Manchester Arena inquiry was a mammoth undertaking. Evidence was heard over 196 days, presented and pored over by 18 legal teams, and culminating in 3 reports running into hundreds of pages. I went to many of the hearings, and while much of what they heard did cast fresh light on the May 2017 bombing, they listened to the evidence with a sinking heart and a sense of familiarity and deja vu. They have spent many years covering the aftermath of the Hillsborough disaster in Sheffield, sitting through 2 years of inquest hearings and 3 criminal trials. The more they heard at the Arena inquiry, the more it reminded them of Hillsborough, and it wasn't the only one. Several Hillsborough families told them that they had an uncomfortable sense of history repeating itself. Margaret Aspinall's son James died in the April 1989 disaster, one of 97 Liverpool supporters who have lost their lives. She says seeing what happened at Manchester Arena brought back painful memories. You saw people were left again without getting CPR. The main thing is lessons have not been learnt. They started to keep a record of the ways the 2 tragedies seemed to overlap, and quickly realised the seeds of disaster had been sown well before each fateful day. At both Hillsborough and Manchester Arena, joint working between the organisations responsible for crowd safety had failed. The Hillsborough inquest found that in the years before the disaster, Sheffield Wednesday FC had not agreed any meaningful contingency plan with South Yorkshire Police, and the club had not been part of a working party whose other members included South Yorkshire Police, the fire service and local councils. At Hillsborough, the club's safety certificate was 10 years old and hadn't been updated despite changes to the ground, which had impacted on capacity and stewarding. A document called the Green Guide was relied on by the club. It was a voluntary code with no legal force and open to interpretation. In Manchester, British Transport Police, BTP, Greater Manchester Police, North West Ambulance Service and Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service were supposed to work together on a joint planned response to an emergency through a local resilience forum with meetings every 6 months. The Arena inquiry heard that in the 2 years leading up to the attack, officers from BTP were only present at a third of those meetings, and those who had attended weren't senior enough. The Manchester inquiry also found that venues operator SMG UK and its security contractor Showsec both had inadequate risk assessments. It also ruled that a breach of the Arena's premises licence, a failure to agree a minimum number of stewards, may have contributed to the fact the attack wasn't prevented. Companies working at the Arena were also meant to comply with a document called the Purple Guide, which provides important guidance about health and safety at music and other events. The Manchester inquiry found the Arena's private medical provider ET UK fell a long way short of the guidance provided by the Purple Guide. At Hillsborough, ambulances lined up outside the ground, but only one was South Yorkshire's Metropolitan Ambulance Service SYMAS vehicle was allowed onto the pitch, with only one paramedic at the Leppings Lane end. At Manchester Arena, only one paramedic was inside the foyer for the first 40 minutes. Ambulances arrived outside, but a casualty clearing station was set up away from the area where the bomb went off, and the injured had to be lifted there, rather than being offered help inside the arena. At both Hillsborough and Manchester, important life-saving help was given by members of the public. One of the most enduring images of the Hillsborough disaster is that of Liverpool fans carrying the dead and injured on advertising hoards, used to improvise stretchers in the absence of the real thing. The same thing happened at Manchester, with graphic testimony at the public inquiry about what happened to one of the fatalities. 28-year-old John Atkinson, who nearly slid off an advertising board and was then carried out on a section of metal railings. Pete Weatherby, KC, is a barrister who has represented both Hillsborough and Arena families. He told them of some of the similarities were pretty shocking. Something as basic as stretchers in both Hillsborough and the Arena. People who were very, very severely injured and in some cases died were carried out on advertising hoardings in both cases, 30 years apart. There has to be a rethink here. At Hillsborough, the police radio systems failed and officers outside the ground could not hear instructions or communicate. There was a failure to get through to the police control room. The Manchester inquiry heard evidence that not all stewards had radios, and there was confusion about the functionality of the radios issued to some showsex staff. Their training in how to use radios was not adequate. At Hillsborough, families desperate for information struggled to get through on jammed phone lines. Many drove to Sheffield to search for loved ones, but on arrival it was equally impossible to locate relatives, and the way they were treated added to their trauma. Barry Devonside was at the match, but not on the Leppings Lane terraces, where his son Christopher was crushed. Mr. Devonside went to the temporary mortuary to look for the 18-year-old, but police sent him away. He spent 7 hours checking out hospitals and a reception centre before being sent back to the mortuary, where his son's body had been lying all along. He then had to look at Polaroid photos of all the deceased in order to identify Christopher. 28 years later, the story of Andrew Roussos at Manchester Arena bears a horrible resemblance to that of Barry Devonside. Andrew's wife Lisa and their children Ashley, aged 26, and Safi Rose, aged 8, had been on a girls' night at the Arena to watch pop star Ariana Grande. When the bomb exploded at the end of the concert, the three of them were in the arena's foyer. Andrew and his son Isander had been waiting outside nearby to collect them, and were quickly at the scene, but although they found Ashley straight away, they couldn't find Lisa or Safi. The pair walked round and around the perimeter of the arena, leaving their details with police officers and asking for help. They didn't know that they were yards from Lisa, who was lying inside on the foyer floor, or that Safi had been carried out of a nearby exit and put into an ambulance. They were sent from pillar to post, travelling between 3 hospitals until they finally found Lisa in the early hours of the next morning. But Safi remained missing for 14 hours until they were finally told that she died in the explosion. At the public inquiry, they learned that she was alive when she was taken out of the arena and had actually died at hospital. In 2012, the Hillsborough Independent Panel published a report which found that 41 of the victims had the potential to have survived if the emergency response had been different. Barry Devonside's son Christopher was amongst them. Inquests later found he may have lived for 2 hours after the match was stopped. This year, the Manchester Arena inquiry established that 20 of the 22 people killed in the bombing had died from unsurvivable injuries, but it ruled that it was likely that emergency services inadequacies had prevented John Atkinson's survival. Inquiry Chairman Sir John Saunders also said he could not rule out the possibility that Safi Rose Roussos could have been saved with better treatment. The Hillsborough families had endured the double tragedy of the disaster itself and also a 3-decade-long legal aftermath, which has included a public inquiry, 2 sets of inquests, and 4 trials. The Manchester Arena bombing had generated several reviews and reports and a public inquiry, which lasted 2 years. The Arena inquiry included learning which came directly from Hillsborough. After the first set of Hillsborough inquests in 1990, which referred to the victims by number, there was a determined effort to put the victims at the heart of the process second time round. That's why in 2014, the new Hillsborough inquests in Warrington began with a pen portraits process, with every bereaved family invited to speak in court about their loved ones' lives and characters. The experience was seen as positive and has since been used elsewhere, including at the Grenfell inquiry. The Manchester Arena inquiry also began with individual pen portrait family tributes to each of the 22 victims, an approach welcomed by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, who has also worked with Hillsborough families for many years. They think the experience of the Arena families at the inquiry was better than it would have been had it not been for what was revealed about what was so wrong with the original Hillsborough inquest and how impersonal that was. However, not every step of the legal process has been positive for survivors and relatives. At both the Hillsborough inquest and the Manchester Arena inquiry, survivors applied to be given core participant status, which would have afforded them legal representation. In both cases, they were denied. Anna Eyre survived the crush at Hillsborough and it changed her life forever. She went on to become a consultant in emergency planning and disaster management. She established a peer support program for people affected by the Manchester bombing. She says using her lived experiences to help others who aren't legally core participants is her way of paying it forward. Regardless of your legal status, it's a constant thing of trying to make sense of an experience where some people around you have died and you have lived. The randomness of it never leaves you. Those affected by both tragedies also speak of their experience of enduring months of courtroom arguments as organisations involved at both Hillsborough and Manchester Arena sought to blame each other. We see a report of this tendency of public bodies not to feel able to tell the truth at the first time of asking, says Andy Burnham, and sadly that has repeated, not to the same degree, but but to some degree with the Manchester Arena inquiry. The Greater Manchester Mayor is one of those leading the campaign for Hillsborough Law, which would give families bereaved through public tragedies financial support for legal representation at inquiries. It's something we need very urgently. People know that mistakes get made, that's life. What people won't forgive is the covering up of those mistakes, and then the pushing of people already traumatised by their loss into a wilderness where they've left just trying to fight for change, truth and answers for years and years to come. This week, the government announced the creation of a new role, that of independent public advocate. It's part of an effort to improve care of survivors and families of people killed in major disasters, including by supporting them through the inquiries that follow. But it stops short of the full package of measures which some would like to see. The obvious problem with inquiries and inquests is that very often you get a fantastic report and great recommendations, but then it sits on a shelf, says Pete Weatherby, KC. Both Hillsborough and Manchester Arena have resulted in multiple inquiry reports. One thing that everyone involved in both disasters has in common is the hope that they'll be used as a basis for real change, so no one else has to go through similar suffering in future. Rishi Sunak has said the Brexit deal agreed with the EU restores balance to Northern Ireland's politics. The Prime Minister announced the new agreement, which replaces the Northern Ireland Protocol and sets new trade rules on Monday. Speaking on BBC Radio 4's Today programme, Mr Sunak said the protocol had unsettled the balance at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement. People need and deserve government to be up and running, he said. Political parties in Northern Ireland will need the time and the space to consider the detail of the Windsor framework. But he added he was confident that Stormont parties will recognise that this is a good deal and that will enable them to get back into a power-sharing executive. The Northern Ireland Assembly has been suspended since February 2022 after the Democratic Unionist Party walked out of Stormont's power-sharing agreement. The DUP objected to the Northern Ireland Protocol, creating an effective trade border across the Irish Sea from Great Britain. Speaking to an audience in Northern Ireland later on Tuesday, Mr Sunak said the fact that Northern Ireland was able to have open access to the EU and unhindered trade with the UK's home market was an unbelievably special position, unavailable to any other trading nation. And he said if this deal was accepted, Northern Ireland would be in a unique position in the entire world, European continent, in having privileged access not just to the UK home market, which is enormous, fifth biggest in the world, but also the European Union's single market. Nobody else has that. Alongside a series of trade rule changes, the deal includes what's being called a Stormont break, a mechanism allowing Northern Ireland Assembly members to raise an objection and potentially stop a new EU rule applying in Northern Ireland. But the break can only be used when the Northern Ireland executive is fully functioning, creating an incentive for all parties to go back into government. The key decision is whether the DUP decide to sign up to Mr Sunak's new deal, easing the way for Stormont to return. DUP's leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson said the Windsor framework went some way to addressing his party's concerns, but some issues remained. The DUP will take time to come to a collective decision on the new deal. We only received it yesterday afternoon, so we'll study it and take a conclusion on it as a whole. On Monday, Sinn Féin, which is the largest party in the Northern Ireland Assembly, welcomed the deal, although it said it will still need time to examine the details. The party's Vice President Michelle O'Neill called for the DUP to return to devolved government, adding, "We always said that with pragmatism, solutions could be found." Several prominent Brexiteers have backed the deal, including former Brexit Secretary David Davis and International Trade Secretary Liam Fox. Mr Davis called the framework a spectacular negotiating success. US President Joe Biden said the deal was an essential step to ensuring that the hard-earned peace and progress of the Belfast and Good Friday Agreement is preserved and strengthened. In a statement, Mr Biden said, "I am confident the people and visitors of Northern Ireland will be able to take full advantage of the economic opportunities created by the stability and certainty." Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who established the Northern Ireland Protocol, has yet to make a public statement. Mr Sunak indicated he had discussed the deal with Mr Johnson and is expected to address backbench Tory MPs later. The economic research group ERG, made up of pro-Brexit Conservatives, will meet on Tuesday evening to scrutinise the deal before deciding whether to back it. Mark Francois, chair of the ERG, also said he hoped we won't find any nasty surprises which would materially undermine the position of Northern Ireland. The encrypted messaging app Signal has said it would stop providing services in the UK if a new law undermined encryption. If forced to weaken the privacy of its messaging system under the Online Safety Bill, the organisation would absolutely 100% walk, Signal President Meredith Whittaker told the BBC. The government said its proposal was not a ban on end-to-end encryption. The bill introduced by Boris Johnson is currently going through Parliament. Critics say companies could be required by Ofcom to scan messages on encrypted apps for child sexual abuse material or terrorism content under the new law. This has worried firms whose business is enabling privacy, secure communication. Element, a UK company whose customers include the Ministry of Defence, told the BBC the plan would cost its clients. Previously, WhatsApp has told the BBC it would refuse to lower security for any government. Government and prominent child protection charities have long argued that encryption hinders efforts to combat online child abuse, which they say is a growing problem. It is important that technology companies make every effort to ensure that their platforms do not become a breeding ground for paedophiles, the Home Office said in a statement. It added the online safety bill does not represent a ban on end-to-end encryption, but makes clear that technological changes should not be implemented in a way that diminishes public safety, especially the safety of children online. It is not a choice between privacy or child safety. We can and we must have both. But Miss Whitaker told the BBC it was magical thinking to believe we can have privacy, but only for the good guys. She added, encryption is either protecting everyone or is broken for everyone. She said the online safety bill embodied a variant of this magical thinking. Signal has had over 100 million app downloads on the Google Store alone. It uses end-to-end encryption, a system where messages are scrambled so that even the company operating the service cannot read them. Operated by a Californian-based not-for-profit organization, the app's users include journalists, activists, and politicians. WhatsApp also uses end-to-end encryption, as does Apple's iMessage system, and optionally Facebook and Telegram. Apple had proposed a system where messages sent from phones and other devices would be scanned for child abuse images before being encrypted, but abandoned the plans following a backlash. Called client-side scanning, some have said there is an approach that tech firms may end up having to use, but critics argue it effectively undermines the point of encryption. It would in effect turn everyone's phone into a mass surveillance device that phones home to tech corporations and governments and private entities. Ms. Whitaker said backdoors to enable scanning of private messages would be exploited by malignant state actors and create a way for criminals to access these systems. Asked if the online safety bill could jeopardise their ability to offer service in the UK, she told the BBC it could, and we would absolutely 100% walk rather than ever undermine the trust that people place in us to provide a truly private means of communication. We have never weakened our privacy promises, and we never would. Matthew Hodgson, chief executive of Element, a British secure communications company, said the threat of mandated scanning alone would cost him clients. He argued that customers would assume any secure communication, provide that products that came out of the UK would necessarily have to have backdoors in order to allow for illegal content to be scanned. It could also result in a very surreal situation where a government bill might undermine security guarantees given to customers at the MOD and other sensitive areas of government. He also said the firm might have to cease offering some services. There's no one who doesn't want to protect children, Miss Whitaker said, adding some of the stories that are invoked are harrowing. When asked how she would respond to arguments that encryption products protects abusers, Miss Whitaker said she believed that most abuse took place in the family and in the community, where she argued the focus of efforts to stop it should be. She pointed to a paper by Professor Ross Anderson which argued for better funding of services working in child protection, and warned that the idea that complex social problems are amenable to cheap technical solutions is the siren song of the software salesman. A firm that fixes smartphones is calling for an official device repair apprenticeship to be introduced. In 2022, there were almost 72 million mobile phone connections in use in the UK, but repair firm TMT First, which introduced its own apprenticeship after struggling to find staff, points out there is no industry training standard. By contrast, there are 33 million cars on the road and mechanics learning on nationally recognised apprenticeships. There's lots of young techie people out there who perhaps have even tinkered around with phones at home themselves and are really interested in how they can do this better and maybe create a career out of it, Adam Whitehouse from TMT First said. If you think about the technology and all the devices in our homes today, those things need repairing, and when people are taught the correct way of doing that, these devices will last for longer. He founded TMT First, based in Newcastle under Lyme, Staffordshire, in 2006. He says 58 members of staff have come through his firm's training courses so far, and the company now offers its own apprenticeship. One of them, Delaney Bianca, said people stop her in the street when she's out at lunchtime wearing the company logo on her clothes to ask for repair help, but there are no search results under phone repair on the website for the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, a government agency. The Institute's deputy director, Nikki Christie, told the BBC there had not been sufficient industry interest. We would welcome renewed interest in the development of an apprenticeship for this occupation, as it has the potential to be a great entry point into digital careers. Mr. Whitehouse said that his was one of a group of organisations that had submitted a proposal before the pandemic, but several of them were no longer in business. The Department for Education said the government planned to make £2.7 billion available by 2025 for businesses across all sectors to set up their own relevant schemes. Mr. Whitehouse's company, housed in a former British Gas call centre, receives around 10,000 smartphones every month from Samsung, with whom it has a contract as well as other sources. His premises consist of warehouse-sized rooms filled with large boxes full of broken devices and row after row of neat drawers containing spare parts of various sizes. Phones that cannot be fixed get shredded so that the precious metals inside, including gold, can be retrieved and reused. TMT First has also pioneered a new way of fixing some handsets, which reduces e-waste by saving the battery and outside frame. An experienced technician can carry out 15 to 20 repairs per shift, depending on what the damage is. Smashed screens are still the most common issue. We see devices come in that look like they've been run over by a car, said Mr. Whitehouse. When we go back and say, how did this happen? There are times when they actually have been run over by a car. Then it was my turn to have a go at the company's apprenticeship entrance test. I had to dismantle and then reassemble a smartphone after watching Tudor Ion, head of repairs, do it in front of me. It takes a trained technician a few minutes. It took me 45 minutes. It is not difficult, but is fiddly. There are 15 tiny screws underneath the casing and a further 3 equally tiny but slightly different size that attach the motherboard to the frame. Everything has to be carefully disconnected and removed in the correct order without causing further damage. I also had to wear accessories to prevent electrostatic discharge, because a small amount of accidental static, like the shock you sometimes get from walking on carpet, can destroy the delicate electronics inside the device. You need some practical skills, but I still think attitude is the most important, because we can teach you how to repair devices, but you need to have the correct attitude, said Mr. Ion. I think by this he means you have to not be tempted to throw the phone out the window after doing battle with the world's smallest screws, but perhaps that's just me. The rise of the right to repair movement in the US and Europe has seen campaigners pushing the tech sector to help people to fix their devices themselves. Apple now does home loans of technical equipment and publishes long instructional manuals for those wishing to do it, but you end up with an invalid warranty if your repair fails. There are many accounts online of people who found it more difficult than they expected, including me. But is it still a threat to businesses like TMT First? There are plenty of people that can repair cars, there's plenty of people that might want to tinker with their cars on the weekend, but there's also people who want to just get their car fixed, said Mr. Whitehouse. There's definitely a place for DIY repair, but I don't think most people want to fix things themselves. The National Union of Journalists members working for the BBC's regional services in England have voted in favour of strike action over plans to merge some local radio shows. The broadcaster has announced that its 39 stations will share more shows in afternoons, evenings and at weekends. The BBC said it would modernise local services by boosting online content. The NUJ, which said 83% of those who took part in the ballot voted for strike action, no strike dates have yet to be announced. The door remains open for the BBC to engage in constructive discussions, the union has said. Last month, NUJ National Broadcasting Organiser Paul Siegert said there was real anger about the corporation's plans. He said they would completely undermine the BBC's public service remit and take the local out of local radio. Under proposals, the 39 stations in England would keep their own weekday morning programmes, but then share 20 afternoon weekday shows, 10 shows after 6 PM and a single All England programme after 10 PM. Weekend output will also be affected. The 39 BBC introducing shows, which help to discover up and coming musicians, will also be cut to 20 programmes, but with extra time slots to ensure a broad range of music can still be played. The BBC has said local news bulletins and live sports programme will be maintained. When the plans were announced in October, the corporation said about 48 jobs would be lost and £19 million would be reprioritised from broadcast services towards online and multimedia production. Jason Horton, Director of Production for BBC Local, said last month, our goal over the next 12 months is to modernise our BBC local services in England to strengthen our online provision for communities across the country. Separately, NUJ members at BBC Northern Ireland recently voted in favour of potential strike action in a consultative ballot over planned cuts to jobs and programmes. My Money explores how people across the UK manage their spending in a typical week. As prices rise, BBC News has been hearing around the ways of cutting costs and the financial choices people are having to make. Alana is a 27-year-old blogger from northeast Scotland. She rents a 2-bedroom house with her partner Jamie, a delivery driver. Alana has Crohn's disease, a lifelong condition where parts of the digestive system become inflamed, and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a genetic illness that causes chronic pain. The couple's monthly income is about £2,000 from Jamie's wages and their benefits. They have a baby son, Odin. The house was freezing when I got up this morning. Outside it was about -4 centigrade. The heating was on, plus an electric heater in the living room. We're either in debt and warm or freezing cold and still in debt, so I'd rather just have heat. My television licence came out at £13.25. I hadn't expected it to come out today. Another payment of £4.16 went to Lay-By, a buy now pay later company. We're trying to move to somewhere without stairs because it's hard for me to keep using them and my legs are covered in bruises, but we know moving will bring more financial stress. In total, £17.41 went out today, but I received £21.80 in child benefit. it. I stayed at home with my son today. Cost cutter vouchers worth £10 arrived in the post from a local community fund group for families. They're helpful for things like baby wipes, but you don't get a lot from them as Cost Cutter is so expensive. I'm in nearly £1,600 of energy debt and there's nothing I can do. That's on top of about £4,000 of other debt, including credit cards, rent and council tax arrears. A charity called Step Change helped me pay off about half because it was about £8,000 in 2020. That felt amazing, but now I feel like I've taken 10 steps back with my energy debt. There's a fund my energy supplier could use to help me pay it off, so we'll see if I qualify. I've also applied for the warm home discount. Today our spending was £0. I received a refund of £15.98 for a flimsy phone case. I need one because Odin grabs my phone and drops it. Jamie also sent me £40 and he refueled the car for £11.01. A £7.99 Google Play subscription went out, plus payments to ClearPay and Laybuy. The buy now, pay later schemes, first £6.99, £6.69, then £9.79, £9.75, £6.12 and £2.66. Most of these installments are for special shampoo and conditioner. Having a stoma bag means sometimes tablets don't absorb, they literally come straight back out, so it doesn't matter how many vitamins I take, my hair struggles. People don't realise Jamie and I rely on certain items to help manage our health conditions, and the price of these going up has had an impact. These include sanitary pads, sports drinks and clothes that fit over a stoma bag. I scour charity shops for affordable items, but it's not always possible to find them. Next, £24.83 was paid to Klarna for Odin's Christmas present, a little electric car. Matt Hancock and his staff agonised for hours over whether or not he broke COVID guidance when he kissed his aide, leaked messages in the Telegraph show. The WhatsApp messages were sent after the Sun newspaper published a photo of Mr. Hancock kissing Gina Coladangelo. His spokesman said there was nothing new in the messages and absolutely no public interest in publishing them. It's highly intrusive, completely inappropriate and has all been discussed endlessly before, he added. The spokesman said the public coronavirus inquiry had been given access to all the messages. The BBC has not seen or independently verified the messages nor the context in which they were sent. In another exchange, the former health secretary criticised the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, texting that it was causing problems in areas with high rates of COVID cases. The latest 41-hour WhatsApp exchange details how the ex-health secretary and Miss Coladangelo were left reeling as the revelations unfolded. The liaison between the pair provoked strong fury as it showed that Mr. Hancock had broke his own lockdown restrictions, which were introduced to curb the spread of COVID. As he waited the publication of the photos, he texted a special advisor asking, "How bad are the pics?" Reacting to the video of him and the former aide kissing obtained by the Sun, Mr. Hancock then said, "Crikey, not sure there's much news value in that, and I can't say it's very enjoyable viewing." The messages show Mr. Hancock asking his special advisor at the time, Damon Poole, to keep the focus on Miss Colandangelo's appointment. Miss Colandangelo worked as a paid advisor for the government, acting as a non-executive director at the Department of Health and Social Care at the time. The then Health Secretary also asked if another minister could emphasise that no rules had been broken. Mr. Poole asked Mr. Hancock and Miss Colandangelo to think really hard about whether they could have broken any COVID rules. Referring to the social distancing rule to keep 1 metre apart from others when 2 metres was not possible, Mr. Hancock said, "Other than obviously the 1 metre plus, I honestly can't think of any." He added, "The worst they can do is kiss before they legalise hugs." But then Mr. Hancock asked his advisor to clarify what exactly the rules were at the time of the photograph. The two of them then exchanged plans for how they could respond to media coverage. This ranged from acknowledging he breached the social distancing rules, which Mr. Hancock said he didn't think he could do, adding, "I think I just went against the clinical advice," to saying that no rules were broken. In one exchange, Matt Hancock cited social distancing guidance for workers at the time as saying that workers should maintain social distancing guidelines wherever possible, to which his advisor responded, "Yes, but it was possible clearly from the picture." And in a separate published exchange, Matt Hancock sought the advice of the former Chancellor George Osborne about a video statement he was due to put out announcing his resignation. Mr. Osborne said it was good, but suggested he probably wants to include the apology to your loved ones you have in the letter. He eventually resigned over the matter, publishing a video on his Twitter page. Joe Tanner, a former advisor to Boris Johnson, said that politicians have a tendency to think they're a bit superhuman when they are asked to apologise for their actions. People in these roles can be quite bullish, so actually getting them to be human can be quite a challenge, she told BBC Radio 4's Today programme. They also think that they're a bit superhuman and that they can get away with it. You can see a bit of that in the approach Matt Hancock was taking. In a separate leaked conversation, Matt Hancock criticised Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme, dubbing it Eat Out to Help Out the Virus Get About. The Treasury paid £840 million to fund the scheme in August 2020, which offered 50% off food and drink as part of then Chancellor Mr. Sunak's economic recovery plan after the end of the first COVID lockdown. In the WhatsApp messages exchanged from the month of the launch, Mr. Hancock said the scheme was causing problems in our intervention areas areas that were under additional government restrictions because they had a higher number of COVID cases. He later said he used the scheme and was thanked by the other diners. So what are the WhatsApp leaks? These are a collection of more than 100,000 messages which have been sent between former Health Secretary Matt Hancock and other ministers and officials at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and have been obtained by the Telegraph. Police say a missing baby is now the focus of their search after a couple, Constance Martin and Mark Gordon, were found and arrested in Brighton. The baby was thought to be days old when the couple disappeared in January. Police have told the BBC they are questioning the pair. Officers are scouring an allotment and golf course on the Sussex Downs in an urgent search involving helicopters, drones and police dogs. Miss Martin and Gordon, a convicted sex offender, were found after being spotted by a member of the public in the Five Ways area of North Brighton on Monday evening. In a direct appeal to the public, Detective Superintendent Lewis Basford said the search was now all about the baby. He told BBC Breakfast there were concerns about the child being exposed to the elements. The couple have been travelling across England by taxi for weeks, apparently evading police, after their car broke down near Bolton, Greater Manchester, on the 5th of January. The arrest location was close to open land and the couple were moving towards that land. We know they travel long distances, said Detective Superintendent Basford. My plea to the members of the public here in Brighton and crossing over towards New Haven is to please be vigilant. Around 20 officers have been spotted combing through Hollingbury Golf Course and Rodale Valley allotments to find the missing baby. Police have also urged people to look through sheds and outhouses. Miss Martin and her partner left their home in Eltham, southeast London, in September after she first showed signs of pregnancy. Their car broke down on the M61 near Bolton and was found burning on the 5th of January, after which the couple travelled in quick succession to Liverpool, Essex and London. CCTV footage showed them apparently trying to hide their faces from cameras. They were thought to be carrying a large amount of cash and to be using camping equipment to live off-grid, police said. When they first disappeared, police said they were concerned that the couple seemed to be constantly moving and awake for at least a few days, which must be especially draining on someone who had recently given birth with no medical attention. They also said there was no evidence that either Miss Martin or the baby had been assessed by medical professionals since the child's birth. At the end of January, detectives offered a £10,000 reward for information leading to the couple's whereabouts. Miss Martin, aged 35, is from a wealthy family and had a privileged upbringing, attending private school and living in a stately home in Dorset. Police said she became estranged from her family after meeting Gordon while a drama student in 2016. Gordon, a registered sex offender, was deported to Britain from the United States in 2010 after spending 20 years in prison for a rape he committed aged 14. MPs have said Boris Johnson may have misled Parliament multiple times over Partygate, but the former PM insists he will be vindicated by their report. The Privileges Committee said it had seen evidence that strongly suggests COVID rule breaches would have been obvious to Mr Johnson, but Mr Johnson said he never knowingly or recklessly misled MPs about lockdown gatherings in Downing Street, and he said he was confident he would be cleared by the committee. He is due to give evidence to the committee later this month. In an initial report published on Friday, the MPs highlighted ways in which he may have misled Parliament. These include a statement on the 8th of December 2021, no rules or guidance had been broken in number 10. Mr Johnson told BBC News he did not know or suspect that events broke the rules when he spoke about them in the Commons. He added that after 10 months of effort, the committee had not produced evidence to suggest otherwise. I didn't mislead the House, and I don't believe I'm guilty of a contempt. I think that this process happily will vindicate me, he said. The committee has published extracts from a series of WhatsApp messages it has received as part of its inquiry. In one from the 28th of April 2021, 7 months before press reports about parties first appeared, an unnamed number 10 official noted that another official was worried about leaks of PM having a drunken situation, and to be fair, I don't think it's unwarranted. In another from the 25th of January 2022, Mr Johnson's then Director of Communications, Jack Doyle, told a number 10 official he hadn't heard any explanation of how a birthday party for the former PM in the Cabinet Room in June 2020 was within the rules. In a separate WhatsApp exchange the same day, an official messaged Mr Doyle saying, I'm trying to do some Q&A briefings for officials dealing with the media queries. It's not going well. Mr Doyle replied, I'm struggling to come up with a way this one is in the rules in my head, adding PM was eating his lunch, of course. The official responded, I meant for the police bit, but yeah, as ridiculous as the cake thing is, it is difficult. The official then suggested they could argue it was reasonably necessary for work purposes. Mr Doyle replied, not sure that one works, does it? Also blows another great gaping hole in the PM's account, doesn't it? In May last year, an inquiry by senior civil servant Sue Gray found widespread rule breaking had taken place, and Mr Johnson was among 83 people fined by police for attending law-breaking events. The Privileges Committee said it would take Miss Gray's findings into account. It emerged this week that Miss Gray has quit the civil service and is set to become Chief of Staff to Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, prompting claims from Tory MPs that she was politically biased. Mr Johnson said it raised questions over the conclusions over her inquiry. I think people may look at it in a different light, He added that he might have cross-examined her more closely about her independence if you told me all the stuff that I know now. He added that it was surreal that MPs investigating whether he misled Parliament over Partygate were planning to take her inquiry into account. If Mr Johnson is found to have misled Parliament, he could have been suspended as an MP or expelled, creating a by-election. But the committee's findings and any sanction on Mr Johnson would have to be approved by a vote in Parliament. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said the evidence of wrongdoing by Boris Johnson is already very straightforward. I think Boris Johnson needs to confront the evidence that's there in front of him. Sir Keir accused Rishi Sunak sitting on his hands through the investigation. Liberal Democrat Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper accused Mr Johnson of trying to wriggle out of the concerning questions raised by the committee. Consultants in England want at least 3 times their basic pay to provide emergency cover for junior doctors during this month's 3-day walkout. The demands have been described as unreasonable by NHS bosses as they try to plug the gaps in emergency care. The British Medical Association, BMA, is recommending its members ask for £158 an hour to work during the day, rising to £262 for night shifts. It said it was right to be paid more for work outside the normal contracts. Consultants earn between £88,000 and £119,000 a year in basic pay. That works out at the equivalent of about £42 to £57 an hour in a 40-hour week. Although average pay is £20,000 higher once extra payments for performance, night shifts and being on call is included. But during the strike, the BMA has advised doctors to ask for £158 an hour to work during the day, £210 an hour to work in the evening, and £262 an hour to work overnight. The BMA said the pay rates should be used by any consultant who is asked to move from their normal speciality, or by emergency care consultants who are asked to do extra shifts or fulfill roles normally done by junior doctors. About 40% of the medical workforce is classed as a junior doctor, and 2/3 are thought to be BMA members who will be asked to walk out between 6 AM on the 13th and 6 AM on the 16th of March across both planned and emergency care in their pay dispute. Junior doctors are calling for pay rises to make up for cuts of 26% since 2008. Danny Mortimer, the chief executive of NHS Employers, said health bosses had sympathy for the plight of doctors, but that was being eroded by the unilateral demands being made for premium pay. He said NHS bosses had not been consulted on the rates, which are included in the BMA official rate card used for extra hours beyond contracted work. If their dispute is with the government with regards to both pay and pensions, it seems unreasonable to act without first seeking any kind of agreement with employers, he added. The rate card was first introduced last year. The BMA said after some NHS trusts tried to cap the amount they were willing to pay for overtime. BMA consultants leader Dr. Vishal Sharma said it's right the rate card was used for the strikes. We wholeheartedly support and stand in solidarity with our junior doctor colleagues in their industrial action and pursuit of full pay restoration. Consultants having themselves experienced real terms pay cuts know all too well the damaging impact pay erosion has on morale and staff retention. On strike days, it is the responsibility of employers to ensure that services are staffed safely, and they have been given adequate notice of when the action is set to take place. The BMA rate card rates are recommended for all work undertaken outside of the normal contract, and they are therefore appropriate to use for covering absent junior doctors, as this work is quite clearly extra contractual. These rates therefore reflect the market value of doctors' work. A woman who has represented herself in court using 80-year-old contract legislation has beaten British Airways in a row over flight vouchers. In January 2020, Jenny Barber booked 2 return flights to Japan departing that May, but the flights were later pulled due to COVID restrictions. BA offered a refund in the form of travel vouchers, but Miss Barber wanted her money back. The airline refused. Representing herself, Miss Barber took BA to court and won a full refund. If you're an ordinary person who is not on the legal profession, going up against someone like British Airways is always scary and it is intimidating, she said. However, Miss Barber, who studied A-level law, was able to beat the airline giant in court using the Law Reform Frustrated Contracts Act 1943. Miss Barber said she had requested the vouchers in effect store credit to the value of her flights in March 2020 after Japan closed its borders to foreign travellers during the first wave of the pandemic. Her frustration began, she explained, when her preferred destination of Japan did not reopen its borders to visitors as quickly as other nations. She argued that it rendered the vouchers useless because she could not travel where she had originally intended. By December 2020, with Japan's borders still closed, she raised the issue with BA and requested a cash refund, but her request was denied. The Birmingham resident told the BBC she spent approximately 12 months, most of 2021, trying to persuade BA to reconsider her request. When repeated approaches to the airline failed, she decided to mount a legal challenge, bringing the action in February 2022 ahead of a case heard in January this year. It was during this period that she came across legislation stating that because the sale involved through no fault of her own, something that was subsequently impossible to deliver, she was legally entitled to her money back. Restrictions on travel to Japan, where Miss Barber once lived, were not lifted did until November 2022. Miss Barber said she was moved to take matters into her own hands because she didn't feel it was right there was no leeway on vouchers when Japan's borders remained shut. Armed with an A-level in law from City College in Coventry, she began to conduct research at her local library. It was here she found out about the law she used to make her case. The case was heard at Redditch Magistrates Court, Worcestershire on the 20th of January, where Miss Barber was awarded the sum of £2,523.42 to cover flights, interest up to the date of judgment, and costs. Miss Barber has now joined a number of Facebook groups for people who have found themselves in a similar situation and has been offering advice. If I can get more people their refunds, I think that is the ideal outcome, she said. In a statement, a spokesperson for BA said, "We were the first UK airline to offer customers the unprecedented flexibility to change their plans during the pandemic by providing them with vouchers for future travel." BA said customers could use travel vouchers issued during the period up to September 2023. Consumer solicitor Gary Rycroft said, "When a business cancels a service that they have been previously promised to provide, it is not unusual for the business to offer vouchers, but it is really important for consumers to understand they don't have to accept vouchers, they are entitled to a full cash refund." I am absolutely thrilled that Jenny decided to see through this case. She absolutely knew what her legal rights are and she stuck to her guns. A double rapist who changed gender while waiting to stand trial has been jailed for 8 years. Isla Bryson attacked 2 women in Clydebank and Glasgow in 2016 and 2019, while known as Adam Graham. The judge said Bryson posed a high risk of offending and would be supervised for 3 years after release. The case sparked a heated debate over whether Bryson should be housed in a male or a female prison after transitioning from a man to a woman. Bryson, aged 31, was initially remanded to a women's jail after being found guilty, but was then moved to a men's facility. This followed concerns about the safety of any woman held alongside a transgender sex offender in a female jail. The case ultimately led to an urgent review and a change in policy, which will see all newly convicted or remanded transgender prisoners initially placed in jails according to their birth sex. The trial heard that Bryson from Clydebank had preyed on vulnerable women who he met online. Passing sentence, Lord Scott told Bryson, "You see yourself as the victim in this case, but you are not." The judge said reports suggested Bryson had a set of neurodevelopmental disorders. "Your vulnerability is no excuse at all for what you did to these 2 women in 2016 and 2019. Regardless of your own vulnerability, in a period of just under 3 years, you raped 2 women who can both be regarded as vulnerable." Lord Scott said Bryson had preyed on his victims because of their vulnerability and raped them in their own homes. He added that the rapist who continues to deny committing the offences would be placed on the sex offenders register for life. Bryson's estranged wife, Shona Graham, said the focus should be on the victims. "The way I see it, he is the man, he done the crime as a man, he should be doing the time in a man's jail," she said. Miss Graham said she had met Adam Bryson in 2015 and they married the following year. The 31-year-old said there had never been any suggestion during their relationship that her husband wanted to become a woman. She said she believed Bryson had hoped to serve the sentence in a woman's jail and have an easier time, but that this had not worked. "You can't do a crime as a man then want to transition once you've been charged with it. That's how you know it's all a big joke to him." Miss Graham alleged that Bryson had attempted to rape her and stabbed her while they were together. She was also angry that the person she knew as Adam Bryson had then used the name Adam Graham. "He took my last name so he could get away with his crimes the way I see it. I hope he rots in jail. I hope the victims can put this evil person behind them." In court, defence advocate Edward Targowski QC said Bryson had been subjected to ill-judged, ill-informed and ignorant comments about the decision to undergo gender reassignment. Mr. Targowski said his client had decided to change gender many years ago, had received maximum amounts of medication and was on a NHS waiting list for a gender reassignment operation. A review into the case was ordered by Justice Secretary Keith Brown and its key findings were made public earlier this month. Although the full report was not published on grounds, it contained personal information. It showed the Scottish Prison Service had made the decision to divert Bryson to Cornton Vale Women's Prison in Stirling rather than the planned destination of HMP Barlini in Glasgow while the offender was in transit. 2 days later, senior management decided, due to the level of risk and remaining uncertainties, to move the inmate to a male prison, HMP Edinburgh. The Isla Bryson case came to the press and public's attention at arguably the worst time for the Scottish Government. Its gender recognition reform bill, aimed at making it easier for trans people to change their legally recognised sex, had just been blocked by UK ministers following a difficult journey through Hollywood. Those opposed to the legislation raised concerns about the potential for a new system of self-ID to be abused by violent men. When Isla Bryson was initially sent to Cornton Vale Women's Prison following conviction, ministers insisted the new legislation had no impact on that decision, but opponents said the case crystallised the issues with self-identification. Isla Bryson's trans status was being taken at face value, yet many, including the First Minister, doubted it was genuine. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon told the Scottish Parliament that Bryson would not be incarcerated in Cornton Vale, either short-term or long-term. Bryson made a decision to transition from a man to a woman while awaiting trial. It is thought to be the first time a trans woman has been convicted of raping women in Scotland. Scotland. There are relatively few trans prisoners in Scotland. The latest Scottish Prison Service statistics said there were 12 trans women and 3 trans men between October and December 2022. There were 7,019 male prisoners and 265 female inmates. The Scottish Government has stressed that the case is not connected to the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which has not yet been enacted and was blocked from becoming law by the UK government. Former Made in Chelsea star Spence Matthews has been searching for his older brother's body on Mount Everest. In 1999, Michael Matthews became the youngest Briton to reach the mountain summit at the age of 22. However, hours later, he vanished, never to be seen again. More than 2 decades on, Spencer is retracing Michael's final steps in an attempt to find his body, recording the experience in a new documentary titled Finding Michael. Michael disappeared 8,000 meters above sea level in an area known as the Death Zone, an altitude where oxygen levels are insufficient to sustain human life. Michael was everything to me, says Spencer, who was just 10 years old when his older sibling went missing. Creating the documentary allowed the former reality star to discover footage of his brother he didn't even know existed. Spencer reveals an incredible video of his brother's 1999 expedition was brought to the table by Dave Rodney, a Canadian climber who had been with Michael on the trip. Mr. Rodney had described Michael as the best mate I could ever have hoped for on the mountain, and said that he was humbled and honoured to be in the film. The Disney Plus documentary sees adventurer Bear Grylls and mountaineer Nirmal Purja also take part in the recovery effort. TV presenter and executive producer Grylls met Michael a few months before he set off to climb Everest. Grylls himself climbed Everest in 1998 at the age of 23. There was definitely a meeting of minds and spirit with a fellow young guy who wanted to stand on top of the world, said Grylls. Obviously then, when the disaster happened and Michael never came home, it was a devastating blow for everyone. He added, 20 years on to watch Spencer now as a man, as a father, as a husband, wanted to try and recover his body and tell Michael's story was a privilege to be a small part of. Spencer referred to the reaction he'd received so far as incredibly humbling, and he hopes the documentary helps people and moves them. An EasyJet pilot made a 360-degree turn to treat passengers to a stunning view of the Northern Lights. The plane was travelling from Iceland to Manchester as the Aurora Borealis lit up skies across the UK in a rare display. Passenger Adam Groves of Lymm, Cheshire, said the incredible sight topped off his 4-night trip, which also saw him get engaged. It came as the country enjoyed a second night of spectacular views. Mr. Groves said he and his new fiancée, Jasmine Matt, were on the left-hand side of the plane, which took off from Reykjavik and would not have been able to see the lights if it was not for the very kind pilot. The pair had actually spent their entire trip in Iceland hunting the aurora without success. Mr. Groves said, we are hoping to see them while we were out there, but we didn't get the chance. We took off and halfway into the flight, the pilot turned all the lights off and the view could be seen out the left window. But we were sitting on the right hand side, and after a few minutes, the pilot switched back and did a 360 loop around for everyone to see. The experience topped off a whirlwind trip for the couple. Mr. Mapp said as his girlfriend accepted his marriage proposal at a beauty spot on the island's south coast. Miss Mapp said, after days of jumping in the car at any opportunity to try and find the Northern Lights without spotting them, finally getting to see them in the sky was the perfect ending to a very special trip. An EasyJet spokeswoman said, we are pleased that the captain was able to perform a controlled manoeuvre in order to allow passengers to witness an amazing display from the air of one of nature's greatest sights. Our crew will always go above and beyond for our customers, and we're delighted to have been able to share this special view with them. Race should be made a central part of the UK's independent public inquiry into the pandemic, campaigners say. A letter seen by BBC News sent to the chairwoman of the COVID-19 inquiry calls for it to look at racism as a key issue at every stage. Ethnic minorities were significantly more likely to die with COVID-19, according to official figures. An inquiry spokesperson said the unequal impacts of the pandemic would be at the forefront of its work. People from ethnic minority backgrounds who lost loved ones during the pandemic also told BBC News they felt sidelined by the process so far. The letter to Baroness Hallett, who is chairing the inquiry, has been coordinated by the group COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice and race equality think tank Runnymede. It calls for ethnic minority communities to be placed firmly at the centre of the inquiry. It has been signed by 26 other organisations, a mix of equality campaigners such as the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants and the Ubeli Initiative, and health bodies including the NHS, BME Network and London-based Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation. The letter has been sent ahead of a preliminary hearing on Tuesday, which is looking at the role of the healthcare system in the pandemic. The inquiry will begin hearing evidence in June. Before then, preliminary sessions are being held to agree which issues should be examined in each section of the inquiry. The COVID inquiry told BBC News that it is committed to looking at inequalities and that their impact on the pandemic will be at the forefront of its investigations. For those who've lost family members, this promise to look at inequalities generally doesn't go far enough. They believe ethnicity should be examined separately. Lobby Akinola, whose father Femi died with COVID in April 2020 at the age of 60, said there's no way race race couldn't have played a role in his dad's death. His father was a regular gym goer with no underlying health conditions. He was a black man in England, a lobby of Leamington Spa, Warwickshire said. Racism is pervasive in every aspect of life. My dad really highlights it, why it's so important to look at this as a systematic and structural problem, because he did everything right. As a carer, Femi was a key worker at the time. People from minority ethnic communities were statistically more likely to be classified as key workers, particularly in people facing jobs that left them more exposed to the virus. If he was going to work with his winter gloves and scarves as makeshift PPE, there's nothing more this man could have done to try and stay alive, Lobby said. At a hearing on the 14th of February, the inquiry's barrister said looking at a racism in the first part of the inquiry, which will examine how prepared the UK was for a pandemic, would be an impossible task. The COVID inquiry told BBC News it had instructed two world-leading inequalities experts to contribute to the first model. Lobby wants stories like this father's to be heard in the inquiry because we've seen firsthand the consequences of racial inequality. As a black man from a black family, it feels like race and the impact that race had in the pandemic has also just been sidelined too. It feels like it's more of an afterthought than being a priority for the inquiry. The inquiry has set up a listening exercise to gather people's experiences. The letter sent to Lady Hallett also alleges that the listening exercise appears to be an entirely separate process to the main inquiry. Rabinda Sherwood, whose parents both died with COVID in January 2021, took part in the exercise 2 weeks ago by filling in an online survey. She said the form was really cold, with some brutal questions including when did your experience start and when did your experience end. After submitting it, she said that's it, an abrupt end. Thank you, goodbye, no signposting to any support you may need. Asked about the listening exercise, the COVID-19 inquiry told BBC News it had appointed specialists in research and communications to enable thousands of people across the UK to share their experiences of the pandemic. Jean Adamson, whose father died in a care home during the pandemic's first wave, said she felt voices like hers have not been heard so far. She said Lady Hallett had promised us that bereaved families would be front and centre of the inquiry. I feel a sense of betrayal because that isn't happening. Nobody is listening to us. A photographer said he was stunned when he captured the shape of a face in a breaking wave at a lighthouse. Ian Sproat took some 4,000 pictures during a 12-hour-long shoot at Roker Pier in Sunderland on Saturday. The 41-year-old from North Tyneside said he was delighted to find the face, adding, I just thought, what the hell. He started his photography 2 years ago to help cope with mental health problems caused by the coronavirus lockdown. Mr. Sproat said his passion was capturing recognisable shapes made by waves and the seascape, and he could not believe his eyes when he came across the form of a face in profile while reviewing his images. The photo got a big reaction when Mr. Sprout shared it on his Instagram page with the caption, could it be the goddess of water Aphrodite or our beloved late Queen Elizabeth? The electrician told the BBC it was not the best picture in terms of composition, but he was delighted with it. He said photography had started as a hobby. I really struggled through lockdown. It hit so hard and I was really stressed with my business. I needed something where I could get my peace, and I found that with photography because you are just in the moment and it takes your mind off of everything else. Every day is a challenge, and if you don't get the picture, you know there is always tomorrow to try again. It changed my life. I'm a different person now. A ferry on which a fire broke out in the English Channel has been towed to Calais, the French Coast Guard said. Passengers are now disembarking after the ferry safely docked, marine authorities have confirmed. The blaze started in the engine room on the Isle of Innisfree on Friday night and was contained according to Irish Ferries. It was sailing from Dover to Calais and had 94 passengers and 89 crew on board. There were no reports of any injuries. 3 lifeboats from Dover, Ramsgate and Dungeness were launched, as well as a French salvage tug. Those booked on imminent Isle of Innisfree sailings will be transferred to alternative sailings, Irish Ferries said. The firm has apologised to all of its passengers for the disruption to their journeys. A statement from the firm said crews train regularly to deal with incidents at sea, and the company has put its training into action and the fire has been extinguished. Irish Ferries later added it will launch a full investigation into the incident in conjunction with the relevant authorities. HM Coast Guard said the vessel had confirmed that the fire has been extinguished, but it had experienced technical issues. A 46-year-old man has died following an explosion and fire at an industrial recycling plant in Perth. The M90 at Friarton Bridge remains shut due to the fire, which broke out at the Shore Recycling Centre in the harbour area at around 20 to 1. Officers said the man's body was found at the scene of the incident and his next of kin have been informed. A 41-year-old man was taken to Dundee's Ninewells Hospital with serious injuries following the incident. Diversions are in place, but people are being advised to avoid the area. Locals reported hearing a number of loud booms from the blast. Scottish Fire and Rescue said the blaze involved about 200 tonnes of scrap metal. Thick smoke was seen billowing across the carriageways of the motorway above. 6 fire engines and other specialist appliances, including a high-volume pumping unit and aerial platforms, were sent to the scene. It is the second major fire at the recycling recycling centre in 6 months. It is the second major fire at the recycling centre in 6 months, following a blaze there in September. A Scottish Ambulance Service Special Operations Team SORT, which comprises specially trained paramedics who provide the ambulance response to hazardous or challenging incidents, was also in attendance. A Scottish Ambulance Service spokesperson said, "We dispatched 2 ambulances and our special operations team to the scene, with our first resource arriving within 7 minutes. We transported 1 patient to Nine Mills Hospital." Chief Inspector Tom Leonard, Area Commander of Hurth and Kinross, said, "Our thoughts are with the family and friends of the man who has died at what is a very difficult time for them. Our inquiries are ongoing to establish the full circumstances of what has happened, and officers are conducting a joint investigation with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service." The Health and Safety Executive, HSE, said it was aware of incident and was assisting Police Scotland with their inquiries. At 12:15, an update from Traffic Scotland said the bridge remained closed, with no timescale for it reopening. It said there were delays of up to an hour on the alternative A90 route. Tayside Police Division said M90 Friarton Bridge, Perth, has been closed in both directions due to an explosion at premises in the harbour area of Frereton Road. Emergency services are at the scene and people are advised to avoid the area.